it is just as much about reaching new audiences and brand awareness as it is performance. Welcome to the Content That Grows podcast, where we chat with folks from all kinds of companies to better understand the content they've invested in, how they did it, and how it impacted the growth of their company. I'm Nate Turner, co-founder and CEO of 10speed.io. Today, I am welcoming back my co-founder, Kevin King. What's up, Kevin?
What's up, Nate?
So today we are, this is the 10th and final episode of season 1. So we wanted to kind of wrap this up by digging into essentially what we've sort of framed as the thesis of this podcast for season 1, which is understanding how people have invested in content, how it impacts their business, everything I just said. And so with that, we wanted to kind of just dig deeper and share some of the stuff we learned from chatting with clients and working with different companies, just kind of understanding what we've seen in our experience and working with other companies in a couple of those areas around, what do those investments look like? How are they actually justified within companies? And what is that like as companies grow and things change? So we're really excited to jump into that today. Starting out, we wanted to really just kind of dig in a little bit and understand, one of the big areas we see a lot is sort of that like short-term payoff versus long-term payoff, and how that changes in companies really wanting to focus on paid where they know they have this clear ROI. We talked about that in episode 1 with Rand, and how it's just hard to kind of get off of that hamster wheel with paid. But outside of that, really want to just kind of dig into what are some of the reasons that it seems as though, companies are struggling with balancing some of the investments in content and brand that really do have a longer term payoff, but can be substantial upside.
Yeah, I think it's two things. I think it's, there's a mentality shift that has to happen, right? Like if it's not really just something that you kind of understand from experience working with specific channels, especially organic, then it's never really going to change in terms of how you view short-term versus long-term payoff. But I think just like that's because of historically how business goals and businesses are built to grow, right? Like they have aggressive goals and people are tasked on teams to hit those goals in likely speedier times. Like when was the last time anybody built goals? I mean, we're getting to there more with like OKRs and things like that around like, yeah, over the next year, we're going to try to accomplish this and break that up. But like at the end of the day, SEO can be a longer term investment than that. So it's really just having a really strong mentality shift around like how to view it. And then also it's just the people who are building it, I think like need to think more strategically about how they communicate the value of that. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's also a progression, right? So like, of course, any company that's very much just starting out trying to prove, like there's no way any company is going to just go straight into big brand investments, and wait 12, 18 months hoping for something to pan out. Like there's a reason that people start with that short-term payoff. So, prove that, whether it's to, another round of funding for acquisition or things like that. But the need for that to shift over time, I think, is where people miss. I think, like you said, the goal setting and sort of expectations doesn't start to shift, and you keep getting these super aggressive goals that just force teams into that short-term view. And it really is something that just builds over time. Even thinking at Sprout and a number of companies that we've worked with, like it doesn't start out that way, but as you get more momentum, it opens you up to have some of those things that you can say, we're going to invest in that. Heard that with the episode with Kristen Bryant from Help Scout. Like, she was talking about how they have the inbound engine going. There's like great SEO content. Now let's look at like, how do we start to, make some of these bigger bets and build that. So I do think it is a bit of a progression, but more often than not, it does seem like you said that companies are sort of getting in that trap of aggressive goal setting that just sort of pigeonholes the team, and they're sort of forced into that.
Yeah. I also, and I think this might have come up on the that last episode too with Kristen was just that idea of being bought in based on just experience, right? Like from a leadership
Yeah.
level. I think we work with a bunch of clients that have already have this like strong understanding or buy-in around organic, and they're looking for people to partner with, or looking to help their team um, support the growth of that, like those specific channels, organic being one. But it's based on some pre-existing like actual maybe hands-on knowledge or hands-on experience or knowledge with the channel, which I think is critical. I think if you don't have that, then that's why I say it's a kind of a mentality shift. You're
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be going swimming upstream a bit in terms of trying to change short term to long term, right? They're going like, well, organic or SEO and PP like these things need to pay off quickly because we have investors or this and that, and we need to grow quickly. But I think like you can tell the difference between a team or even a leadership team that is going to make these investments or bets just based on some sort of experience with it in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it really is, something that also just becomes those bigger investments too, just as the company is getting bigger. Like, it's obviously, you want to talk about early stage company, they might have, um, one content person in house sort of building stuff. Or in some cases, we have, a number of clients that have a content marketer and work with us to sort of supplement and help build some of the strategic content. But obviously that grows over time. You start to say, okay, we've invested in this channel, we've built this out. Now we're going to build out a team in another area. We're going to start a podcast. We're going to start, video series, whatever it might be. But you do also start to get into some of those cases where it's requiring you're hiring very specific skill sets, potentially like higher production costs, things like that. And then obviously you can go all the way out into like, HubSpot's like acquiring podcasts, or like big companies acquiring podcasts or newsletters or communities that come at a big price, but also have a lot that comes with that, and just becomes a bigger and bigger investment. So again, I think it just speaks to like laddering up, but it's not always about just adding more to what you're doing. It may be acquiring totally new skill sets, or branching out into a new content type, or eventually even in some cases making acquisitions.
For sure.
So one of the other interesting things that we chatted about a little bit this week was um, the recent release of the SEMrush content marketing survey, the State of Content Marketing 2022, I think is what it's called. And they have the survey in there with a number of results. So we'd love to just kind of hear, some of the stuff that stood out to you, maybe as a good place to start there.
Yeah. So I think those surveys are always enlightening and interesting. I look forward to them because it helps validate a lot of the direction that like you may be taking, or your team may be taking, or anything, all the bets you are placing from a content perspective. But it's funny because I think when we talk to teams, a lot of times there seems to be some prioritize traffic and over leads and revenue, and some seem to prioritize revenue, leads necessarily over traffic, so quantity versus quality in that regard. But if you looked
Yep.
at like the top three goals that people had for this next year, they were all traffic related, including traffic I think was number two.
Organic traffic.
um, yeah. Um, like it's interesting the revenue isn't number one, when you really would think, especially um, things you read on social or blog posts you read, that like those are the things that you should be building your goals around, et cetera. And maybe there's just something not like really surfaced there, but it's kind of funny to see that like all of the top three are traffic related. I think brand awareness was one
Mm-hmm.
or two,
Yeah.
yeah, which would be from a organic perspective tied to growing your organic traffic, and obviously there's other channels in play there, but I found that really to be like a big standout, revenue being
Yeah.
so far down the list.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, and then related to that, what you were talking about like investing in content and everything. Um, I feel as though that survey skews a little more tactical, um, which makes sense. So we're not talking about people investing in, building a whole new web series or something. But um, the one of the questions was sort of like, how do you expect your marketing budget to change in 2022, or content marketing budget, excuse me. And over 70% of the respondents said it was anywhere from small to a large increase, but over 70% saying it is going to increase. So it kind of brings us back to like what you just said, and what we're talking about here is like, so over 70% of people are saying their content marketing budget is going to increase. We know from talking to people all the time, 9 times out of 10, people are like, it's about revenue. It's about, proving content's going to drive revenue. But when you see the respondents, the metrics they're tracking, the goals that they have, it's traffic, brand awareness. So how, like, that's what I think is so interesting is this internal conversation with companies around how they're actually justifying the investment, whether it's we're making the bet or they're somehow trying to back into, every traffic or every visitor we get is worth X amount, 5 cents or something, like trying to really, really, really quantify that. So that to me continues to be, a big question mark for a lot of companies, and just an interesting thing that we see from company to company.
Yeah, and the brand awareness aspect is super, it's super interesting, just because obviously there's a few ways you can measure that. It'd be interesting to see how ultimately most companies are tracking that. Like, again, I mean, I obviously will continue to point towards organic, but like you can have some really like quantifiable brand awareness in your, group search console data, and looking at your branded queries growing up over time as you produce more content and put it out there for organic consumption. There's,
Yep.
PR tools and things like that that can track like branded mentions, social, all that stuff. Like, so it's probably a list of a variety of things, but like the value that they place on that would be interesting to understand, like how they quantify the ROI on the brand awareness if revenue is further down the list.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And it's so again, I think, as I said, I feel as though that's maybe a little bit of a reflection of who some of the survey respondents are, and kind of how they're viewing things. Um, as we think about like anytime we chat with CEOs, CMOs, or even just in our own experience of kind of like executive buy-in on content investments, I think one of the interesting things is like when you really focus, like I'm a huge believer in bottom of funnel content. I know you are too, just like high intent, high converting stuff. Even if there's zero search volume, it's probably capable of generating revenue. But we also know that like just doing paid search, just trying to create bottom of funnel, super product focused content, you are limiting yourself to, anyone that's already reached that point versus helping increase the number of people reaching that point and like expanding your brand. So I think that's where that conversation always has to go, is like it is just as much about reaching new audiences and brand awareness as it is performance. And the majority of the time you are not going to see the content coming through as a direct conversion from whatever you're doing, whether it's a blog that ranks in organic search or social content that you're posting on LinkedIn from your CEO or leadership or anything like that, or video series or any, whatever it might be. I think that's continues to be what we see over and over and over, is like it's not directly driving a ton of conversions. The bottom of funnel stuff will, but it's heavily influenced by the stuff that's higher up.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too because you said it was a lot of the survey has to do with the respondents, but it also has to do I think somewhat in the phrasing of the language too because it's all like you could almost probably have maybe a different um, response order or result if you changed it to like or added quality traffic to that increased
Mm.
quality traffic because there was one again around increasing traffic but it didn't specify that and
Yeah.
like we know that there's like significant opportunity when you go up funnel with content, especially from a topic perspective, which is where all the eyeballs are going to be. But like, how do you quantify that against what you're saying the bottom of the funnel traffic is, and like how you can push people down the funnel? So it's just
Yeah.
it's interesting because quality there's a quality versus quantity balance that needs to happen there.
Yeah. 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 And it's, I mean, I think that's where like the executive perspective on the investments, because again, it's one thing to say, we're going to spend extra 5,000 or 7, 8,000 a month on this, whatever it might be. But when you have executives saying like, I would love to put $1 million into this, I just want to know like what is it going to do, and that doesn't necessarily mean please tell me exactly how much MRR I'm going to get from it. But that's where like having that ability to have that conversation at the executive level and say, here's what we're seeing, here's how we understand, brand, what like you mentioned earlier, brand query volume increasing over time, in different ways you can kind of understand that you are building an audience, you are increasing awareness, and you are bringing people into that funnel that is worth kind of building that over time.
Yep, totally agree.
So another thing that would be kind of cool to dig in with you is like related to that, just thinking about kind of like how I've mentioned video series and podcasts and some different types of content like digging in I guess a little bit on how those influence other channels too, whether it's ultimately coming through direct traffic or other channels like um, just some thoughts on how those are impacted.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's interesting because the traditionally you can look up online the types of content that you can map to each stage of the funnel if you break it down in like three stages like top middle bottom and like you have your how to's and informational stuff up top and then you get further down you have case studies and white papers and then more product stuff or versus pages. um, I don't think there's like a very clean way to really talk about how like everything impacts or those different content types, especially if you get like really specific and you like create some sort of white paper that gets distributed and ends up being linked to across a variety of channels. Um, but I think like as long as you're creating content that is like ultimately what your audience needs to solve a specific problem, I think
Yeah.
you shouldn't be looking at like the specific direct traffic or anything like that as the thing to try and unpack. Like you just have to try and understand exactly how a specific piece of content is actually driving value that you can actually see, if that
Yeah.
makes sense, within Google Analytics or whatever your analytics platform is, or
Yeah.
your CRM or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it was Chelsea with Chili Piper in one of the episodes talked about how they don't only track the quantitative aspects of it. They also look at who's engaging, like with social posts or whatever. Like who's engaging, looking them up. Like are they their sort of their ICP, their target audience? Like just sort of that additional validating signal that people are engaging. This post has a way higher engagement rate. Let's dig into why. But then also, who is it, and is that actually like reaching our target audience? I thought that was a really interesting way to do that as well.
and that's the thing is like different types of content might require different types of tracking. Like I'm sure there's tons of different companies out there that have created their own custom way of like looking at different content types. So everyone, there's so many creative ways to do things, and there's lots of talented marketers like that out there. But there isn't just one size fits all thing. I remember like the number one drive, if this is from Bamboo, when we were at Sprout, our top driving revenue piece of content on the Bamboo side was we created a white paper. You know, it was a very
Mm-hmm.
traditional approach, at least in terms of like we partnered with a PR firm and really tailored this specific content to solving a problem and detailed it out, and especially in a space where that was trying to we were trying to make an impact on with employee advocacy. But
Yeah.
ultimately, we knew that at the end of the day, it was one of our top driving pieces of revenue driving piece of competitor or of content, because we ended up building out more custom tracking within Salesforce on how it was being used. And that can be the right or
Yeah.
wrong way now. That was a few years ago. I know you can still do it. You can build out campaigns that tie to a specific piece of content. But like ultimately it's not one size fits all. And like if we didn't do that, that was a gated lead gen piece that maybe today you wouldn't necessarily gate. I don't know. It depends on the business, but we probably wouldn't have been able to track it as well because it was a PDF.
Yeah.
And but that really gave us insight into like, you know, how much revenue or anything it was driving, because we actually had it. We were deliberate in how we were tracking it within a specific platform that would not necessarily have been able to be tracked in like something like maybe a Google Analytics.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. And the other interesting thing, kind of shifting from, we've looked a little bit at like internally, like how you're kind of making that argument, how you're thinking about whether or not you track the metrics and quote unquote ROI or attribution around some of the efforts. But another really big factor in the investment of everything is some of the external factors, and like competition, just how difficult your space is, like all of that stuff. I think makes a huge difference, and I feel like is probably one of the most misunderstood components, especially when you're talking about competing in terms of search. But there are other aspects, certainly certain niches that have very, very competitive, like a number of popular podcasts or whatever, that would just be, even that would be kind of challenging to stand out. So I think that, to me, that's a huge component as well when you look at the investment. One that I think a lot of teams struggle with, knowing how to size it up and like what's actually necessary, and then two, um, being realistic about, sure, you want to compete against Zendesk, that's great. Well, here's what it would actually take, if you want to reach like Zendesk level, amount of organic traffic and leads and everything, or whatever the example may be. That I think, even at a smaller scale, I think a lot of times folks are not quite aligned in what it actually would take versus what they are aspiring to.
100%. It's interesting when like people take a look at like what the competitive space is doing for content, and a company is trying to understand exactly what they should invest in. Like there's so much that you can key off of from the competition to understand exactly how you should be investing and like what you should be investing in. And I mean, like it may be obvious to some, but like the if you look at what um what a competitor is doing across all channels, any type of content. It doesn't have to be just organic. Like it can influence what you're talking about, which obviously informs the actual like kind of strategy in terms of just like literally what you should be saying, because they've already paved some way. There's that. But like from an investment
Yeah.
standpoint, like how much you need to create, how often you should be creating it. Um, there's such easy things to basically be able to give you or enable you to like actually um, understand the level of investment. Like obviously it's going to be directional to some extent, but like if you can throw a competitor into a third party tool like a SEM
Yeah.
Rush or Ahrefs and see, look at over the past 24 months, this company has produced 350 pieces of content, and it's all like, around XYZ topics that like are relevant to our business. Well, like we're at zero, for
Yeah.
example. We have to, in order to bridge that gap, like we might need to either do that, but then also bake into the sense that like they're already 2 years ahead. Um, it's really important to look at those things because it does give you a better sense of like what it will take, to actually get there to where you want to be. And then again, like they're ahead, so you might need to do even more than that.
Yes. Yeah. To close the gap. Yeah. Totally agree. Yeah. It's like you can pretty easily look at how much your competitors are doing. And again, not even just blog content, but if they also have a podcast and, all these other formats, like you can get a pretty good sense of like the volume they're doing in a month, the publishing cadence, anything like that. And if they're doing 20, then what's the point of, setting out? Well, there is a point to setting out and doing 2 a month if that's all you can do and do well. But you need to reset your expectations on how you will perform against them, if you are woefully behind in like how much you can put out and produce. So the I think that's a big factor. And then the same thing kind of goes for like occasionally we talk to companies that have domain authority of like 10, and going up against some real giants in their space, and that also just takes a very realistic approach that it's going to take longer. So again, same thing if you're talking about a podcast that's launching and you're going up against SaaStr podcast or something that's just been around for a long time and tons of reviews and ratings and highly ranked or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think there's a lot of those that um, do factor into how you look at what that investment is. One caveat I'll add, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is it's hard to know what it will take or what will work because it's sort of like, let's just create something to go viral. Like there's not necessarily a formula for that. But there are times when companies can sort of jump the line and create something that does like truly stand out, and progress them forward much faster to where they get a ton of attention, ton of backlinks, and then from there can continue building and kind of like get that jump. So I'm not saying it's not possible, and it's always going to be a long road to catch up, but yeah, by and large, I think that's typically kind of how we would look at the external competition.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally. And every situation is different. Every competitive landscape is different. Like, I think there's, you used the example of HubSpot earlier, which is obviously a huge company. So like, they're not necessarily a good example, but just to use that, like they've been acquiring blogs, right? Like, you could look at the
Mm-hmm.
competition, and depending on what your, budget is or whatever, you could be like, well, this could be a way to bridge the gap, and then we can have this to invest in actually starting to create our own content, or we can do that and re-optimize the content to fuel growth in some
Yeah.
interesting way. Like it's not all like it's not it's just not all cut black and white from each, business to business. It's all different. And I
Yep.
think, the other thing too, which I think gets misinterpreted or misunderstood or whatever with, competitive gap generally, if you want to call it that, is that like, you know, the, that you like, oh, that's what they're doing, that's what we should go do. It's much more strategic and requires a bit more critical analysis than that, right? Like you should segment their content and be like, well, I don't know if that topic intent wise is going to actually drive the conversions we need, right? If they're a one-to-one competitor and you can get some sort of insight into maybe what they're doing from a revenue perspective, then yeah, maybe it'll make it easier. But like some
Yeah.
businesses are starting out and competitors are only doing like a fraction of what they do from a functionality perspective if you're a product, right? So like you need to be doing more than just what they're talking about. Plus, also, like, I can't count the amount of times we've gone into a competitive gap analysis in the top performing posts that they have or top pieces of performing content that they have has absolutely nothing to do with the business. It's,
Correct.
like it's driving tons of eyeballs. I doubt it's doing anything to build brand. Like it has to sometimes it has to do with some pop culture moment, or I mean, it's so
Yep.
common. It's actually kind of funny. Um, and maybe it got them some sort of acceleration on terms of like in terms of visibility, because like they cast such a wide net, something's got to come through. But like it's taking up time and resources from teams,
Yep.
and ultimately money. So like yeah, like it just requires so much analysis. And the only reason, the last thing I'll say about it is I know this too, because I've seen SEOs or content marketers on Twitter really like kind of scoffing at the competitive gap analysis, because I
Yep.
think that's the thing people think is just go create what they can. It's like, no, it is a fundamental aspect of doing this, right? Like, of course you want to come up with ideas and be creative on your own, but
Yep.
people are out there and they've given you a signal on at least a little bit of what's happening out there. So then you can use that to make informed decisions, strategic decisions, not just blind copying.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I think if you do the competitor analysis in Ahrefs or any of those tools, like what it spits out requires a lot of refining, and even that is only like to me one piece of the puzzle. Like you said, it requires digging into their actual content and more of those things that will give you better context. But yes, like straight up and down, what that report spits out is almost like unusable without like really paring it down, because it's just focused on you know typically those few pieces of content that are huge performers but aren't bringing in the right people, um, or just not relevant to your business because it doesn't overlap and just takes a lot of work to pare it down. But when you do, I agree, there are a lot of interesting insights and signals that bring it closer. Um, so one of the last things I wanted to kind of dig in on that we've been talking about some internally within our agency is like when shouldn't a company invest in content? So that to me is a pretty fascinating way to think about things, and I've certainly in calls with more like sales call type of interaction with folks, had a lot of those conversations where you kind of know the budget, where they're at, and just times you can kind of tell like it just doesn't make sense. So love to kind of get your perspective on that first.
Yeah, it's I definitely think that there are times when like you shouldn't invest in content. I think it's rare, um, or I'm sorry, that's a smaller percentage of businesses likely. Um, but it definitely happens in like there's a few scenarios I think that like ultimately it happens. I mean, um, I think that if you are at 100% overly technical in terms of a product, and maybe third party tools are like coming up goose eggs on any type of data to tell you that there's some sort of volume. This is across all channels. Maybe this isn't worth it. Like maybe you should be creating some content out there to educate, but I don't think if you can't use anything to like give you some sort of directional idea of like what's out there, then I think that that's partially or that's a, a cause for not investing in content. But again, I think that that's going to be quite rare, right? Like sometimes you're going to have like even just things your audience needs to understand in terms of using your product and all that, right? And even if the data's not there, you should create it, right? So I don't mean to be
Yep.
contradictory or anything, but like it's no, it's the reality. But that could happen. The other is ultimately if there's no real way to tie your product to content, even if it's super top of funnel. Like we've gotten to the point of like being really strategic, of course, but like really thoughtful about how we can make sure that if we're going really up funnel to get as many eyeballs as possible, like what is the possibility that we can, um, get people to product. I think Ahrefs is the one that like has a really good model for product led or SEO, right? Like around like
Mm-hmm.
they give a grade 1, 2, 3, and ultimately if this can tie to product, you give it a 1 or 3. I can't probably have backwards, but you can't go if you go through that exercise and basically everything is like I can't talk about my product at all or mention it in any realistic way. then I don't know if content's going to be the thing that's going to be the big accelerator for you.
Yep.
Um, um, there's that, and then there's possibly a potential around like product market fit, right? If you haven't really gotten there, maybe the demand in the market is really just like you're just touching on specific topics that, again, I think that ties back to just product led
Yep.
kind of SEO in a sense, right? Like if there just isn't really enough like interest in out there that like seems to be quantifiable in some way, then I think that it's probably not necessarily a viable case. But I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I agree, and I think what you're saying with product led SEO is like, uh, one thing I'll often say is like, what are some of the things you would create regardless? Like, if there's no potential organic traffic, there's no potential social reach or any sort of engagement, like, would you create this anyway because it's valuable to someone who's considering working with you or buying a product, or help sales or whatever it might be? And I think that's sometimes helpful because like there are things that you just should create and do that, but I think it's still just different from like, we are going to invest in content as something that we see as a big driver for our company over the next 5 to 10 years or something. Like, to me, those are two different things. There's still always going to be some content you're gonna create, no matter what. But in terms of the investment, I think a few of the things that I've seen and talked with folks. One is like, run into companies where you kind of start digging in, and who buys your product, who what's the pain points, and it's like, well, there's 150 total companies in the world that can buy our product. Uh, like, sure, you can
Yeah,
create content, but like, there's not a ton of upside, versus thinking about, you know, Sprout getting into, million plus sessions a month and in organic traffic, and HubSpot far beyond that. Like, there's a ton of upside there when you have a total of 150 potential customers. That's your TAM. Like, that, I don't know, I just don't know that I would really say that it's worth a big investment in the content. Again, still creating some of those pieces that are critical to do no matter what, but like the investment doesn't seem to be there. um, I think another one is when it's pretty clear that the leadership is, kind of going back to what we said at the beginning, extremely, extremely focused on direct ROI, immediate outcome, and just can't wrap their head around anything else. That, um, to me, is typically like, I just wouldn't, in that current climate, I wouldn't really consider investing there. I just continue to invest in places that are going to do that, because that's just an extremely challenging thing to try to change over time, especially when you're putting dollars in hoping for a longer term payout. It's
yeah.
just the patience isn't there.
I think you're on to something. Like we keep it's well, it's been a theme, but like that top down, it's buy-in is huge. But like this is a little bit more like maybe uh, aspirational, or maybe it's not always the case. But if there's not like a true strong perspective from leadership on like something about the market or anything, I just don't think that there's going to be any sort of like movement or momentum on content. I think like the best companies that I've worked with, and I think we've worked with, that have produced investing content, and this it ties into being bought into like understanding that content comes over time, or content succeeds over time, is like they've been super passionate about their industry and have like a very unique perspective around what they offer, how to solve problems, and all that. Like we do
Yep.
try to incorporate subject matter expertise in the content, right, when we can, because we're an agency and we're not the experts. But I think that's a really big thing that like ultimately, like if you don't have that, it's probably a hard thing to be self-aware of maybe, but like
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed it's very consistent across the companies that are really like successful with content and also just like produce a lot and are willing to keep trying, is like, no, we believe that there's something to be said here. That's why our product exists. That's why I created the company, or we created the company, and let's go and talk about it in as many different interesting ways. and even flip concepts on top of their head, right? Like get in front
Yep.
of people in front of that. So
Yep.
that's I think a big
Yeah.
one, but hard to quantify.
Agree. And I know, a lot of recent internet fodder has been around like, life's too short to work for a company whose CEO doesn't understand marketing or whatever, like some of those concepts. But I think it'd be really helpful to maybe just kind of wrap up on if someone is, because I don't want this to feel like doom and gloom, like they either get it or they don't. Like maybe just to kind of wrap up on like if someone is either considering a role and want to kind of understand if that's there or just in kind of like feeling out even just the company they're in and what that would look like. Maybe just kind of hit on a few practical things that they can look for to kind of gauge that within a company. So I don't know if you have any thoughts to start for that.
If this is if the to identify if it's worth like taking that role to
Yeah, taking a role, or just if you're already in a company that's trying to gauge like the conversation around investing in content and
yeah
what would kind of need to be provided for someone to buy in on that.
yeah I think ultimately there's probably a few things. I'll see what I can rattle off. Uh, I think if there's a conversation around like siloing content in any way, that seems to be always a red flag around like if they truly understand content. Like there is a lot of recent internet fodder as well around like around siloing content
Mm-hmm.
positively is a positive thing. Again, goes back and
Mm-hmm.
forth. And what I mean by that is like, there's, there is brand and there is SEO content and all that, but like, I still think we know to, at the end of the day, that a lot of these things do they play together and right. So like, if people are
Yep.
deliberately not being able to understand and collaborate across those things, that's probably like um, something that needs to be sorted out before fully really investing in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Uh, and Yeah, I think that's a big one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say it's certainly like noticing the language, like we talked about earlier, around like how things are discussed. If it's very short-term results, or I only want to do, I only want to do stuff that works, or I'll give you as much budget as you want, but I want, this is the return. As long as you give me this return, I'll give you as much budget as you want. Like, some of
Mm-hmm.
those things I think will kind of stand out as uh, something to make note of, that there may be a little bit of challenge there. But I think the the things that are always interesting to me is like when people are good, whether it's a CEO or CMO or whoever in leadership, like really just um, I think when they kind of know they want to build a brand, they want to be the best, they want to be well known for X, Y, and Z. Those tend to be signals that like they are someone who's sort of in this for the long run. It's not how do I put in $1 to make two nonstop and just pump it up and get some big valuation and sell or whatever. And really, as someone who's like you can just kind of see from that language that there's a desire to build a brand and do things that are going to invest in that and build it over time. Um, so I would say that's a big one. Just kind of understanding what are the goals, what's the current uh, state of like marketing channels. Is there anything going on that's already a little bit more experimental or brand focused that you can tell is being invested in already at a smaller scale without this need for an immediate direct return. Things like that I think can also just be helpful signals for that.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and I think ultimately the if you get signal from leadership, again we talk about leadership a lot this conversation. I hope I don't come off as contradictory, but like ultimately, yes, you want to have people who have understanding and experience within, um, or at least some working knowledge of what should go into content to like actually invest in appropriately. But I almost say like the counter to that is like this over indexing on what they believe that content should be. Like,
Yeah.
I think that we work with a lot of, um, or we've had experience in the past with, like early stage or even just like companies starting out where like they're like, oh, I want to create XYZ and this is that and all that. Like, but they don't have the work, any knowledge, but they do like believe in content. That can go the wrong way fast if content if there isn't a dialogue around like really what the content should be. It's really like, no, I know we need to create this, and that's coming from top down. That can get
Yeah.
tough because
Yeah.
there's a lot that goes into creating a great piece of content, including research and strategy and positioning. There's a lot of really great CEOs and founders and exec teams that do have really great ideas like that. But like at the end of the day, especially if you're growing and you've already started to grow, like the people, there should be a trust in the teams that are building out the content to like actually understand what to be creating there. But ultimately, even if it's early on, I think like
Yeah.
if that overconfidence on what should be created, not that
Sure.
they should create it, that could be
Yeah.
a signal.
Yep. Yeah. Totally agree. Awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up here in a minute, but yeah, thanks for listening. This is the, like I said, the last episode of the season. So excited to wrap this one up. If you've enjoyed this, please check out 10speed.io/podcast for show notes, any additional information. Go ahead and subscribe to get updates as we launch season 2 in the coming weeks, and really excited to continue the dialogue around some of the tactical things, investments, and as well as chatting with other folks and getting their perspective. So thanks so much, Kevin, and this was really great.
Yeah, this is awesome. Can't wait to do it again.